Noah Seichmann is a Brazilian sociologist, writer, and researcher whose work explores the intersections of sociology, philosophy, and spirituality. Educated at the Federal University of Santa Catarina, UFSC, where she earned a master's degree in political sociology, her research centers on alternative social models, collective organization, and ways of knowing that challenge modern Western assumptions. Through ethnographic immersion in rainbow gatherings around the world, she studies how community, ecology, and spirituality intertwine in real-world experiments of utopia. Her writing blends academic analysis with poetic reflection, showing a commitment to decolonial thought, ecological awareness, and the idea that knowledge itself can be a creative, lived practice. This master thesis follows the author's immersion in several rainbow gatherings, temporary, non-commercial, nature-based communities, across different countries to see how people can organize daily life without bosses, money, or rigid rules. Using field diaries, collective notebooks, and lots of conversations, it maps a utopian way of knowing that puts cooperation, care, and intuition at the center rather than hierarchy and strict rational planning. The gatherings work through shared work, like cooking and cleaning, open circles for decisions, and conflict handling practices that favor calm, consensus, and responsibility over punishment. The argument is that these small, lived experiments show utopia not as a far-off perfect society, but as something we can practice now, a flexible, many-voiced social fabric where knowledge comes from experience, relationships, and attunement with nature, an alternative to modern habits of control, ownership, and one right-way thinking. Juan Manuel Serrat. They want to snuff out the dawn, utopia, because it fills people's heads with dreams, enchants them, works small miracles, and subverts whatever order is in charge. But utopia is stubborn, it won't settle for what's merely possible and it whips up storms of rebellion. Juan Manuel Serrat is a Catalan-Spanish singer-songwriter and poet whose socially and politically charged lyrics made him a major cultural figure in Spain and Latin America, known for blending poetry with music and for his enduring influence on Iberian and Latin songwriting. The author thanks life, the journeys, and a wide web of people, places, books, and beings that shaped the work. She gives special gratitude to her advisor Jacques Mick for bold, sensitive guidance, and to friends and colleagues at UFSC's Laboratorio de Utopia and Tópicos Utópicos who helped her rethink and reinvent ideas. She acknowledges close friends who offered support and reflection, fellow travelers and interviewees from rainbow gatherings who revealed the unity of Earth and the rainbow spirit of love, joy, and hope, as well as many communities and projects that showed her another world in the making. She expresses deep love for her mother Avatel, father Pablo, and brother Tom, her greatest wealth and anchor, along with thanks to nature and the universe, and recognizes CAPES for essential research funding. The Apresentação, preface, of Limite do Horizonte explains that the thesis was born from lived experience rather than pure theory, a journey through encounters, travels, and reflections that blend sociology, philosophy, and spirituality. Noah Seichmann situates her work as both an academic and personal exploration of utopia, not as a fixed ideal, but as a living, evolving practice of community, imagination, and coexistence. She frames her writing as a map of sensations, thoughts, and relationships experienced within the rainbow gatherings and beyond, where knowledge emerges through interaction and participation rather than detached observation. The presentation invites the reader to see the research itself as part of a utopian experiment, a dialogue between the rational and the poetic, between knowing and dreaming. In Introduction, Knowing and Dreaming, Noah Seichmann opens the thesis by linking the human drive to understand the world with the equally powerful need to imagine and dream it differently. She argues that knowledge and utopia are not opposites but complementary forces. Reason provides structure, while imagination opens possibilities beyond the limits of what is known. The introduction challenges the modern belief in objective, detached knowledge, proposing instead a more fluid, participatory way of knowing that includes emotion, intuition, and collective experience. By blending philosophy, sociology, and personal reflection, Seichmann frames her study as both an academic inquiry and a poetic search for alternative ways of being and thinking, a call to dream as a legitimate form of knowing. Seichmann argues that overcoming the Western habit of separation requires learning to think with others, embracing diversity, dialogue, and interconnection as the true foundations of knowledge and imagination. She argues that to escape the modern Western monoculture of rigid, controlling thought, we must reclaim knowledge and utopia as living, plural, and relational practices rooted in diversity and continual transformation. The author urges us to move beyond modern epistemology's measurable confines by engaging the undefined, emotional, spiritual, and intuitive unthinkable as creative partners, embracing uncertainty and dialoguing with the unknown so new understanding can emerge that feels as much as it reasons. Seichmann contends that humans are inherently hybrid and relational, so instead of forcing life into fixed categories, we should embrace its fertile chaos by knowing through participation, sensing, and co-transformation with others. She urges a playful reshuffling of modern thought, blending art and science, reason and intuition, to break rigid hierarchies and rediscover knowledge as a living, ever-evolving process of creative renewal. In Utopias of Now, Theory and Practice of Utopia Today, Seichmann redefines utopia as a living, everyday practice rather than a distant, flawless dream. Drawing on contemporary thinkers, she argues that utopia exists in small, real gestures of resistance, creativity, and community that challenge dominant social orders. Instead of being a blueprint for a perfect world, utopia becomes a method, a way of questioning what is taken for granted and experimenting with new forms of coexistence. These utopias of now are plural, temporary, and imperfect, emerging in moments of cooperation, mutual care, and shared imagination. For Seichmann, the power of utopia lies not in its final realization but in its ongoing ability to inspire transformation and to keep the horizon of possibility open. In Immersion in Utopia, Cartography of Rainbow Encounters, the author turns from theory to lived experience, describing her fieldwork among the rainbow gatherings, nomadic, non-commercial communities that form temporarily in nature to live cooperatively, beyond the structures of modern society. This section documents her ethnographic journey through 6 gatherings across 5 countries, where participants experiment with alternative ways of living, sharing, and knowing. Rather than using traditional research methods, Seichmann adopts a cartographic approach, one that maps feelings, movements, relationships, and meanings as they emerge. Her goal is not to analyze the rainbow as an object, but to participate in it as a dynamic, collective organism and to understand utopia from within, through lived interaction and embodiment. She begins by reflecting on how the rainbow's structure, without leaders, money, or formal institutions, creates a space where cooperation, trust, and self-organization become essential. Everything, from cooking to conflict resolution, happens through voluntary contribution and communal decision-making in circles. The gatherings function on principles of nonviolence, respect for nature, and radical inclusion. The family metaphor dominates: everyone is welcome, but participation requires responsibility, humility, and active presence. Seichmann notices that this anarchic order works precisely because it resists control, it thrives on flexibility, constant adaptation, and a shared spiritual ethos rather than strict rules. To deepen her understanding, Seichmann invents experimental research tools aligned with the rainbow's free-flowing spirit. With collaborators from UFSC's Laboratorio de Utopia, she creates 2 collective diaries for participants to write in during gatherings, one focused on documenting daily experiences, and the other on imagining utopias. These notebooks circulate freely, gathering words, drawings, reflections, and emotions. They become living archives of the collective consciousness, filled with multiple voices and perspectives. Through this participatory method, Seichmann expands the meaning of research itself. It is no longer the detached recording of data, but a co-creation of meaning through shared experience. Her narratives from specific gatherings, such as those in Brazil, Israel, and Europe, illustrate how utopian values are enacted and tested in real time. At the Brazilian Rainbow Gathering in 2018, she describes a series of small miracles and tensions: the survival of the collective diaries through storms, spontaneous rituals, the generosity of shared meals, and the friction that arises when people test the boundaries of cooperation. These scenes reveal that utopia is not an idealized escape from conflict but a practice of navigating difference with empathy. For example, when conflict or aggression occurs, instead of responding with punishment, participants may chant mantras like Om or Ho'oponopono, a Hawaiian reconciliation ritual, transforming moments of discord into opportunities for healing and reflection. Sykman also paints vivid portraits of the rainbow's sensory and symbolic world. The gatherings revolve around a sacred fire at the center of camp, both a literal hearth and a spiritual heart of the community. Around it, the big circle gathers daily to share food, music, and conversation. Subgroups form naturally, smaller zulas or camps where people cook, create art, or hold discussions. The environment itself, mountains, rivers, forests, acts as a teacher, dissolving the boundaries between human and nature. For many, the rainbow is a spiritual experience where ecological awareness and transcendence merge. The divine is encountered not through doctrine but through coexistence. Another key insight of this section is that imperfection is essential to utopia. The rainbow is constantly in flux, messy, emotional, unpredictable, but its resilience lies in this very instability. Each participant is simultaneously student and teacher, guest and host, individual and collective. Work is voluntary, guided by the principle of service rather than obligation. Sykman observes how the absence of hierarchy allows for self-organization, but also demands maturity and empathy. When people stop contributing or misuse the collective space, the system temporarily falters, yet it rebalances through informal correction and renewed cooperation. In this way, utopia becomes a living process, sustained by continual practice rather than imposed order. Sykman's cartography also reveals the pedagogical dimension of the rainbow. Learning happens through doing, through cooking, cleaning, mediating conflicts, and caring for others. These acts are not merely practical but deeply ethical and spiritual. She quotes participants who describe the gatherings as a school of the heart, a tool for expanding consciousness, and a rehearsal for a new world. In this learning environment, mistakes are part of growth, and knowledge circulates horizontally, through experience rather than authority. The process mirrors her sociological argument that knowing is not about control or mastery, but about openness, participation, and transformation. Finally, she situates these experiences within the broader context of her thesis. The rainbow gatherings exemplify an emergent utopian episteme, a new way of knowing and being that challenges modern dualisms. This episteme values connection over separation, intuition over rigidity, and diversity over universality. In her words, the gatherings demonstrate that utopia is not an unreachable ideal, but an ongoing practice of reimagining the possible through community, empathy, and creative coexistence. Through this immersion, Sykman suggests that to live utopia is not to arrive at perfection but to stay in motion, to dwell in the horizon where knowing and dreaming continually meet. In Outside of Truth, a cartographic exercise, the author explains that her research intentionally steps beyond traditional academic expectations of objectivity and method. Instead of treating the rainbow gatherings as an object to be analyzed from a distance, she embraces a cartographic approach, an experimental, participatory way of mapping lived experience as it unfolds. This means following sensations, relationships, and intuitions rather than fixed hypotheses. She rejects the idea of a single truth, arguing that knowledge emerges from interaction and movement, not from detachment. Her writing itself becomes part of the experiment, mixing observation with emotion, reflection, and poetic language. By doing so, Sykman aligns her method with the anti-hierarchical, spontaneous ethos of the rainbow community, making her research both a study of utopia and a practice within it. In The Tone of the Rainbow, Sykman explores the atmosphere, rhythm, and emotional field that define the rainbow gatherings, their tone, in both a literal and symbolic sense. She treats tone as the unique frequency that gives the gatherings their identity, a combination of shared values, behaviors, and feelings that hold the group together without the need for formal structure. This tone, she explains, cannot be fully captured through traditional sociological description. It's something one must feel and participate in. It's composed of subtle, interwoven elements, peacefulness, spontaneity, care, vulnerability, music, and ritual, that create a social fabric unlike that of mainstream society. The rainbow tone reflects a conscious refusal of modern noise, no commerce, no hierarchy, no technology dominating the space, just human presence, nature, and the flow of shared life. Sykman describes how the gatherings unfold in a rhythm guided by the lunar cycle, with life organized around a central sacred fire. This fire serves as both physical and spiritual heart, a gathering point for communal meals, music, and conversation, where participants come together in circles that embody equality and inclusion. Decisions are made through consensus, often slowly and imperfectly, yet with deep respect for collective voice. Speech alternates with silence, rational debate with song or prayer. The tone of communication itself becomes ritualized, inviting listening and empathy rather than confrontation. The repeated greeting "Welcome home" captures the emotional texture of the rainbow, an immediate sense of belonging that dissolves boundaries between strangers. Music and sound play a central role in establishing this tone. Drumming, chanting, singing, and spontaneous improvisation become daily forms of connection and expression. Sykman emphasizes that these musical practices are not entertainment but a form of communal language that bypasses intellectual barriers. They invite participants to synchronize, breathe together, and feel collective energy. The tone of the rainbow is therefore not metaphorical, it is literally audible and vibrational. It's how the community sustains coherence without fixed rules, harmony through resonance, not authority. When conflict arises, rather than arguments, participants often respond with collective sounds, like the mantra Om, as a way to dissolve tension through vibration, re-establishing unity without repression. Another aspect of the tone is its moral and ecological sensitivity. Sykman notes that participants are guided by unwritten principles: non-violence, respect for nature, voluntary simplicity, and mutual care. Even practical activities, cooking, cleaning, building compost toilets, carry a spiritual charge, performed as acts of service to the collective rather than obligation. The absence of money reinforces an ethic of sharing and trust. Food is donated or found communally, and all work is voluntary. Through this, the rainbow creates a lived critique of capitalist and bureaucratic systems, showing that community can emerge through generosity rather than transaction. The tone of the rainbow thus expresses a form of embodied utopia, an emotional and ethical tuning toward cooperation and gratitude. Sykman also highlights the fragile balance that sustains this tone. Because the gatherings are open and leaderless, they rely on the continuous goodwill and attentiveness of participants. The tone can shift easily, moments of disharmony, selfishness, or neglect can disrupt the communal flow. Yet, the rainbow's resilience lies in its ability to retune itself through care and ritual. The tone is maintained not by enforcement but by collective practice, singing together, sitting in circle, keeping the fire burning, offering forgiveness when mistakes happen. Sykman observes that this continual maintenance mirrors her broader thesis about utopia as a process, not an endpoint. The rainbow tone survives precisely because it is fluid, something recreated moment by moment through the interplay of difference, listening, and renewal. Ultimately, the tone of the rainbow shows that the gatherings embody an epistemology of feeling, a way of knowing that arises through effect, rhythm, and presence rather than abstract reasoning. The tone is the thread connecting the individual and the collective, the inner and outer, the spiritual and the social. Seichmann suggests that to understand this space is to be changed by it. It teaches through resonance, not representation. By attuning herself to this field, she transforms her role as a researcher into that of a participant listener, tracing the rainbow's living vibration as both a sociological phenomenon and a metaphor for a new way of being together. In Dive into Colors, Noah recounts her personal immersion in several rainbow gatherings, describing the sensory, emotional, and spiritual experiences that brought her research to life. She details the journey through forests, rivers, and mountains to reach the gatherings, the warmth of the welcome tent, and the vibrant coexistence of people from many cultures living simply and collectively in nature. Through these lived moments, sharing food, singing around the sacred fire, and learning to let go of control, she experiences utopia not as theory but as a living, breathing practice. The colors symbolize the diversity of people, emotions, and experiences that compose the rainbow's world, a temporary society where difference becomes beauty, cooperation replaces hierarchy, and every gesture, whether washing dishes or meditating, embodies connection. Seichmann's dive into this multicolored reality becomes both an ethnography and a transformation, revealing utopia as something one must live to understand. In Walker, There Is No Path, she uses the famous verse by Antonio Machado as both a metaphor and a method for understanding utopia and knowledge. The section reflects on the idea that there is no pre-existing path to a better world. Each step must be invented through action, relation, and experience. Drawing from her time at the rainbow gatherings, Seichmann shows how the community embodies this principle. No one leads or dictates direction, yet together people create a living route through cooperation and intuition. The path emerges only as it is walked, through the continual process of making choices, facing challenges, and learning collectively. In this way, utopia is not a destination or fixed model but an unfolding journey shaped by those who dare to walk it, an act of trust in movement, creativity, and the unknown. In If There Is a Path to Walk, the author reflects on the delicate tension between freedom and structure within utopian practice. While the rainbow gatherings reject fixed hierarchies or predetermined systems, she observes that some shared rhythms and forms naturally emerge: rituals, communal meals, the morning call to work, or the nightly circle around the fire. These recurring patterns act like gentle paths that help the collective function without becoming rigid rules. Seichmann suggests that even in spaces devoted to spontaneity and equality, a certain degree of coordination and care is necessary for harmony. Thus, a path to walk does not mean an imposed order, but a collectively created way of moving together, an improvised choreography of mutual responsibility. Utopia, in this sense, is a living balance: freedom that breathes through shared rhythm, and order that remains open to change. In Walker, Your Eyes Are on the Path and Nothing More, Noah explores how focus and attention shape the experience of utopia and knowledge. She suggests that when we are fully absorbed in the journey, attentive to each step, each encounter, each act of care, we begin to understand life as process rather than goal. In the rainbow gatherings, this means being present to daily tasks like cooking, cleaning, or listening in the circle, where the meaning of community is built moment by moment. By keeping one's eyes on the path, participants learn to value the immediacy of experience over distant ideals or abstract doctrines. Seichmann links this mindful attention to a decolonial and ecological sensibility, knowing through presence, not possession. The walker's gaze, humble and grounded, replaces the modern obsession with control or destination. In this way, utopia becomes not a dream of elsewhere, but a deep, continuous awareness of the now. In There Is No Path, Just Stars in the Sea, she deepens her reflection on uncertainty and navigation as metaphors for living utopia. She writes that in the absence of fixed routes or maps, social, moral, or intellectual, what guides us are subtle lights, intuition, affection, signs, and shared moments of meaning, like stars reflected on the water. These stars symbolize the small flashes of connection and insight that orient people within the fluid, unpredictable life of the rainbow gatherings. The sea, vast and shifting, represents both the collective and the unknown. Seichmann suggests that learning to move through this oceanic uncertainty, trusting relationships and inner guidance instead of rigid systems, is itself a utopian practice. The lesson is that meaning and direction do not pre-exist the journey, they shimmer briefly in interaction, dissolve, and reappear, inviting continuous navigation through openness, wonder, and faith in the living weave of existence. In When You Look Back, You See the Path That You Will Never Tread Again, Noah reflects on memory, impermanence, and transformation as essential parts of the utopian experience. Drawing from her time in the rainbow gatherings, she notes that every encounter, emotion, and moment of community is fleeting. Once lived, it cannot be repeated. Looking back reveals not a path to follow again, but the trace of something unique and unrepeatable, like footprints washed away by the tide. This awareness invites acceptance of change and loss as natural forces in both life and knowledge. For Seichmann, utopia lives in these transient experiences, not in permanence or perfection. Its beauty lies precisely in its passing, in the way each act of connection alters us and leaves a subtle mark before dissolving. The backward glance becomes an act of gratitude, recognizing that every step, however brief, helps weave the ongoing, unfinished journey toward what is possible. In the musical scale, Seichmann uses music as a metaphor for the diversity and harmony of the rainbow gatherings and, more broadly, for the nature of utopia itself. Just as a musical scale is made up of distinct yet complementary notes, the community is composed of many individuals, each contributing a different tone, rhythm, or vibration to the collective whole. Seichmann observes that living together in such a free, fluid environment requires constant tuning, listening to others, adjusting one's own frequency, and embracing dissonance as part of creation. The rainbow thus becomes like an improvised symphony, where unity does not mean sameness but resonance through difference. She suggests that utopia, like music, is a living composition, always in motion, never complete, and beautiful precisely because it depends on the interplay of many voices in continual dialogue and renewal. In The Pot of Gold, the author reflects on what lies at the metaphorical end of the rainbow, the elusive treasure that the gatherings seem to promise. She concludes that the true pot of gold is not a physical or final reward but the experience itself, the living practice of community, connection, and transformation. Through her immersion, she realizes that utopia's value comes from what it awakens: trust, empathy, shared responsibility, and the rediscovery of joy in simple coexistence. The rainbow's openness, its refusal of hierarchy and permanence, makes it fragile yet profoundly alive. Participants learn to live without guarantees, to find abundance in giving rather than owning, and to embrace impermanence as part of beauty. Seichmann frames this as both a sociological and spiritual revelation, that the gold is the subtle shift in consciousness that occurs when people live as if another world is already possible. The end of the rainbow, then, is not a destination, it is the moment when everyday life itself begins to shimmer with utopian possibility. In On the Horizon, Clearances of an Emerging Episteme, Noah gathers the insights from her journey and fieldwork to describe what she calls an emerging utopian episteme, a new way of knowing and being that is taking shape through lived practices like the rainbow gatherings. She argues that this emerging worldview dissolves the rigid separations that define modern thought, between reason and emotion, human and nature, science and spirituality, and replaces them with a sense of interconnection and reciprocity. Knowledge, in this horizon, is no longer a means of domination but of relationship. It is participatory, effective, and grounded in care. Seichmann identifies signs of this shift across contemporary movements: ecological, decolonial, spiritual, artistic, that share a desire to heal the fractures of modernity and to reclaim ways of knowing rooted in coexistence. The rainbow becomes her living example of this transformation, a space where people experiment with new ethical, social, and spiritual forms that blend experience and imagination. In this light, utopia is not an unreachable ideal but a lens for perceiving the world otherwise, a method for unsettling the familiar and opening paths toward renewal. She calls these clearances on the horizon, openings where different forms of life and thought begin to breathe. They are temporary, fragile, and plural, but together they signal the birth of an epistemology that values intuition, interdependence, and imagination as legitimate sources of truth. Sykman ends by suggesting that the task of sociology, and of humanity, is to listen to these emergent voices and to learn how to dwell in the in-between spaces where the rational meets the magical, and where the horizon is not a limit, but an invitation to keep moving. In On the Spiral Curve, Noah Sykman brings her thesis to a philosophical and poetic culmination, using the spiral as a symbol for how knowledge, life, and utopia evolve, never in a straight line, but in cycles of return and transformation. She argues that human understanding moves like a spiral, revisiting familiar questions and experiences, yet always from a slightly different height or perspective. This form contrasts with the linear, progress-driven logic of modernity, proposing instead a dynamic in which growth includes repetition, reflection, and renewal. Through her experiences at the Rainbow Gatherings, Sykman shows how this spiral motion is lived, through ritual, music, emotion, and community, where beginnings and endings constantly merge. Each encounter or collective act becomes a turn of the spiral, carrying traces of the past while generating new possibilities for connection and awareness. The spiral thus represents both the rhythm of utopia and the movement of consciousness itself, fluid, continuous, never complete. She extends this metaphor to a broader vision of an emerging world where knowledge integrates reason with intuition, individuality with collectivity, and the human with the cosmic. The spiral curve is not a path toward perfection, but an invitation to dwell in process, to keep evolving through encounters, contradictions, and creativity. In her final reflection, Sykman suggests that to live utopia is to join this spiral dance, to participate in the endless unfolding of life and meaning, moving toward the horizon while knowing it will always expand before us.